My Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek. And in a recent video, I compared the movie Megamind with some of Tolkien's ideas fleshed out, mainly in Silmarillion, but also in other places, on the nature of what it's like to be evil and how that kind of results in futility and even boredom, ultimately. And one of the people who commented on that video raised the question of, but wouldn't it also be boring to be in a perpetual state of just pure bliss? Wouldn't that just get dull after a while? And so I figured I would address that topic here in this video. And this is going to go a little bit beyond Tolkien because there's a lot of different things you could bring into this discussion, but I'll try to keep it fairly short and get to the point. But I do want to bring in some outside stuff that Tolkien might have had in his mind as a Catholic specifically, and see what we think about it. So the first thing to note here is that some of the outside stuff I'm referring to is in the realm of Christian theology, and this is why I think it's somewhat relevant to Tolkien as a Catholic. There's a strand of thought in Catholic theology called Theodicy, which is basically it's the attempt to rectify the idea that there is a good God but an evil world. And one particular approach to theodicy is this idea that some evil is necessary for proper human development because humans need struggle in their lives, and if we had everything come easy to us, then it wouldn't really develop us as human beings. And while I think there is truth to this argument, I don't think it necessarily accounts or adequately explains the existence of actual evil in the world. And by evil, I am encompassing all that might be called evil in a Christian theology type sense, not just malevolence on the part of thinking creatures, but also natural evils like hurricanes, epidemics, anything that might cause serious harm and stuff like that. I mean, those would be distinguished from, say, the fact that if you fall and twist your ankle, you hurt yourself. That's not so much an evil in the same sense because it's a certain amount of pain is kind of necessary to make sure that you don't end up doing damage to yourself. So, for example, hypothetically, let's put ourselves in the situation of Adam and Eve before they ate the fruit, right? If you put yourself in that situation and you imagine that they can't feel any pain, the minute they discover fire and don't know what they're doing with it, they're both going to burn themselves really badly unless they actually feel the pain of the excess heat of the fire. Some of that is actually necessary. But what I'm distinguishing here is things like I mentioned, hurricane, that sort of thing that cause death, disease, things that are not necessary for our own self-preservation, basically. So there's a strand of theodicy that says some of this stuff is actually necessary to human flourishing because we don't develop properly as human beings without some degree of struggle, and therefore we have to have some of this bad stuff in our lives in order for us to overcome it and therefore grow as human beings. Now, I'm going to avoid discussing why I don't think that's necessarily an adequate explanation for evil beyond saying I think you could explain that aspect of human development without resorting to the types of evils that I'm calling evils as opposed to merely the fact that you get hurt when you twist your ankle or touch a fire or something like that. Because, and this is where it kind of goes into Tolkien's direction where I think his insights are useful, there are ways in which we can struggle and overcome things that don't necessarily implicate those types of evils. And so where do I go with this? Well, let's take a look at what Tolkien had to say about bliss and also the creatures that he envisioned in a state of bliss. So there's a remarkable passage in the Silmarillion, basically right around the time that the two trees of Valinor get destroyed. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can check out my Silmarillion synopsis. I'll link to that video series in the link in the description below, and I'll also link to my Megamind video too. You'll want to check that out if you're not really familiar with this topic. Should have mentioned that sooner. But anyway, there's a passage near that point where he basically says, there's usually not very much record of times of happiness and joy and peace because those things are kind of their own reward. You don't need to remember them. There's, you're just living in that joy and not really having to worry about it. Whereas when bad things start to happen, you start to get more records because there's not much to say about happiness. You're happy, but when bad things start to happen, can you imagine what would a story be like if it was just, oh, I'm happy all the time? It would be a boring story. So in that sense, there is some truth to the idea that bliss is boring. If Turin Turambar, if his story was all about how everything went well in his life and nothing really challenged him, and he never had any conflicts, that wouldn't make a very good story. It would be a very boring story. But would it be boring to live in it? Tolkien finishes the thought basically saying that, but when bad things start to happen, now we start to keep records because things are lost that you do need to remember. Not everything that was lived through during the period of bliss in Valinor lasted, and therefore the elves had to remember it in other ways, like by keeping records of it. So that is an interesting point by Tolkien that fits into this, and the interesting thing about it is how it reflects on the fact that the elves were living in bliss. Now, what are the elves doing while they're living in bliss? Well, various different things depending on which elves you're talking about. The Noldor, of course, are the ones that are most interested in making things, doing things with their brains or hands. They're looking for ways to make things or devise languages or change things in that sort of way. The Teleri, on the other hand, like shipbuilding and exploring the ocean and that sort of thing. And the Vanyar are more interested in poetry and being in more close communion with the Valar themselves. Men we never see in a state of bliss, and so we never get an idea of what Tolkien envisions as for men as being their natural state if they were in a perfectly blissful state without fear, death, and all these other things to worry about, although it's questionable whether he thinks they were subject to death before some imagined fall in the Silmarillion. It's not really clear. But the main point here is what we see the elves doing in a state of bliss is not merely just wandering around being happy all the time. It's not just that. They're doing things. They really are actually actively participating in creating their own joys and bliss in Valinor. And the Noldor are perhaps the most obvious ones to use because they're the ones that we spend the most time with throughout the stories of the Silmarillion. But you can look at the others as well. I mean, the devising of poetry that the Vanyar are like a little bit more into compared to the others is something that Tolkien himself, of course, engaged in quite a lot. And it's wonderful to read Tolkien's poetry, but can you imagine the sense of accomplishment you would have if you were actually the one who wrote all that poetry? So if you can imagine the amount of joy that you get from accomplishing a significant task in your own life, let's take my own example. My day job, I'm a lawyer. So, every now and then I get to do something that's a little out of the ordinary and may be very fulfilling if I actually do it well. If I take a case to trial and win it, that's really nice. If I, write a brief that's really, really well done and wins a motion, that's also really nice. But this obviously applies also to art and things like that. So the idea that the Vanyar are making poetry, like Tolkien did himself, that is something that is fulfilling kind of in and of itself. But it's not like it comes just naturally. Even the best poets in the world have to work at their craft. They don't just spout it and there it is. You do have people that are, more naturally inclined that way than others, but everybody has to work at it at least a little bit. And so even the best poets, when they put together something that's really, really good, can look back on that and take satisfaction in their accomplishment. And so in that sense, I think we can say that even in a blissful world without any either moral or natural evil, you do still have some level of struggle in the sense that there's effort involved. You can't just, oh, it just comes easy, because that probably would be boring in the end. But when you get this idea of actually having to work to produce something, but that thing that you're producing is good, and the work involved is not actually costing you any harm per se. It's just, you're actually having to put forth effort. That in itself is something that can be something to explain why a blissful state of existence would not necessarily become boring. And here's where it ties into kind of the final point I want to make, which is Tolkien wrote a little bit about this same topic in a couple of different places. One place that he wrote about it was in a poem which he wrote basically to C.S. Lewis on the nature of myth-making and that sort of thing, and the poem itself is called Mythopoeia. And you can find that online, and I'll link to at least one of the places you can find it in the description below as well, so you can check that out for yourself. But in this poem, he's basically making the point that humans are naturally bent towards making these kinds of stories. They're not just frivolous exercises. They're, things that we're naturally inclined to do, and they have their uses. These fairy stories or myths, they have their uses for the human psyche, for human development, and that sort of thing. And he developed the same idea in the essay on fairy stories, which I've done a video on before, and I can link to that in the description as well. But the idea that he gets into in the fairy stories essay or lecture, which he kind of briefly touches on in Mythopoeia, but not quite as much or as directly, is the idea that we are by nature makers because we are made by a maker. And the point he makes, and I think in fact he quotes Mythopoeia in the fairy stories lecture at this point, he basically says we are makers because we are made to be that way. It's part of our nature because of who made us. God creates us to be what Tolkien would call sub-creators, or his idea of sub-creation is this idea of creative energy that is not ultimately creative, because only God can actually create out of nothing. So Tolkien uses this term subcreation to apply to the idea that we make things that are new, but are not really totally new. We're always taking elements from the world around us and recombining them in different ways. In the same way that poetry takes the things that are already present. We all know the words, we all know what a rhyme is, we all know what alliteration is, we all know what these things are, but every time you put together a new poem, you've done it in a new way, and in that sense created something new. And similarly with the Noldor creating gems and all these other things, they didn't create anything ex nihilo out of nothing, but they managed to use things that were there to make things that are new and interesting and beautiful and all these other things. So this idea that runs through Mythopoeia and on fairy stories, at least parts of them, is the idea that part of our nature as human beings, and let's face it, elves are just kind of an accentuated aspect of humanity in this sense, and Tolkien would say that, is the idea that because we are naturally bent toward making things, even if, not necessarily making physical things, but could be making poetry or music or whatever it is, those are things that, enhance our own well-being in some sense. It's a natural part of who we are. Now, again, some of us are better than that than others. And I am not a very creative type, but, even in this video series, I'm creating something that hopefully a lot of you get some benefit out of. And, it helps me because I like to do it, and it helps other people because they like to watch it. So I'm not taking anything that you didn't already necessarily know if you've read all the same works that I have, but maybe it makes you think of it in a different way. And so pulling all of these different strands together, I think the answer to the question that was posed in the comment is the idea that even in a purely blissful state, we can find things to challenge us because we can always be trying to find new ways to, from a Christian perspective, say, because that's what Tolkien is, he's a Christian. From his perspective, you can be finding ways to create things to give glory to God. So, you could be making poetry or songs that glorify God. But, even if you're not necessarily a theist, if you believe that a perfectly blissful state is achievable, you can still say that, creating art benefits both the maker and the people who, see or hear the art, whatever kind of art it is. And so in that sense, you've always got something that can provide some level of struggle in the sense of challenge, and also something that provides satisfaction that isn't merely destructive and futile in the way that what Megamind or Morgoth were involved in their own storylines. And so ultimately it's not the same kind of reduction to nothingness in the way that, you know, evil operates. Good can actually operate towards making new things and enriching our lives and doing that sort of thing. So I don't know that this is Tolkien's answer to the question, but I suspect at least part of his answer to the question would be no, in a perfectly blissful state, we would merely be living out our own function as sub-creators, doing sub-creation for the glory of God, and that would both increase our own bliss and the bliss of others around us, and, you know, make God happy as well, because that's who we're aiming it towards. So, again, I don't know that that would be Tolkien's answer, and maybe he hadn't even thought of it in an explicitly theological context, but at least it provides us an interesting thought process of how we can look at this and see that it could be that way. You know, it could be that, you know, in a Christian perspective, if everybody goes to heaven, what are we all going to be doing all the time? Subcreating for the glory of God. You know, that could definitely be an option. And that's one way in which bliss would not be totally boring. So if you did see that prior video, or especially if you're the guy who made that comment, I hope this kind of addressed that question in a way that was meaningful and kind of fleshed out the ideas, and I hope you find it satisfying. But if anybody else has their own thoughts on the idea, I would love to hear them in the comments, because it's definitely an interesting topic. So, hope you enjoyed that video, hope you got something out of the discussion, and like I said, please do leave a comment if you have your own thoughts on it. Until the next time, of course, you can subscribe to me on Twitter at JRRTLore if you want some occasional Tolkien trivia questions. You can subscribe to the channel here, you can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.